The morning air cut through everything like a knife. February in Oklahoma doesn't mess around, and this particular Tuesday felt colder than most. Inside the warm house on Maple Street, a woman named Carol stared down at the tiny puppy in her hands. The little German shepherd was so small she could hold her with just one hand. At 8 weeks old, most puppies of her breed should weigh around 12 pounds. This one barely hit 3. Carol had been breeding German shepherds for 15 years. She knew what buyers wanted. They wanted big, strong dogs that looked impressive. They wanted puppies that would grow into protective family pets or working dogs. They definitely didn't want runts. And this little one was the smallest she'd ever seen. The puppy's eyes were still that cloudy blue color that young dogs have. She looked up at Carol with complete trust, not knowing that her size had already sealed her fate. Her tiny tail wagged weakly, and she made soft little sounds that were supposed to be barks but came out more like squeaks. Carol's husband walked into the kitchen, already dressed for work. He took one look at the situation and shook his head. They'd had this conversation before. Small puppies meant vet bills. They meant potential health problems. They meant keeping a dog that would never sell, taking up space that could go to a profitable puppy. "You know what we have to do," he said, not even looking at the little dog. "We can't keep every runt that comes along. This is a business." Carol nodded. She'd been telling herself the same thing all night. But when she looked down at the puppy, something twisted in her chest. The little one had been eating well. She was alert and playful, just small. Really small. But there was something in those eyes that seemed almost human. She pushed the feeling away. Business was business. An hour later, Carol's car pulled up to the county animal shelter. The building looked tired, like it had seen too much sadness. Paint peeled from the sides, and the parking lot had more potholes than smooth spots. A sign by the door read, "Oklahoma County Animal Services," in faded letters. Carol had brought animals here before. Sometimes when a puppy didn't make it, sometimes when an older dog could no longer breed. The shelter took them all, no questions asked. That's just how things worked in this part of the world. She grabbed an old cardboard box from her garage and placed the puppy inside with a thin blanket. The little dog immediately curled up in the corner, sensing that something big was happening. Her tiny body shivered, though whether from cold or fear, Carol couldn't tell. The shelter didn't open for another 2 hours. Carol knew this. She also knew they had a drop-off area behind the building where people could leave animals when the staff wasn't there. It wasn't the warmest option, but it meant she wouldn't have to explain why she was giving up a healthy puppy. The back of the shelter was just a concrete area with a small overhang. A few other boxes and carriers sat there already, waiting for the staff to arrive. Carol placed the cardboard box next to the others and stood there for a moment. The puppy looked up at her with those trusting eyes, tail still trying to wag. For just a second, Carol thought about picking her back up, taking her home, finding a way to make it work. But then she remembered the bills, the space, the reality of running a breeding business. She turned and walked back to her car without looking back. The puppy didn't understand what was happening. One moment she was warm and safe, surrounded by the familiar smells of the only home she'd known. Now she was in a strange box that smelled like old newspapers and someone's lunch. The ground beneath her was cold and hard. Wind whipped around the building, carrying scents she'd never smelled before. She tried to call out, making those tiny squeaking sounds that were supposed to bring her people running, but no one came. The box was too tall for her to see over the sides, so all she could do was listen to the unfamiliar sounds around her. Cars driving by on the street. Other animals making noise from inside the building. The wind rattling things. She couldn't see. When the shelter staff arrived 2 hours later, they found 5 new animals waiting for them. 3 cats and carriers, 1 medium-sized dog tied to the fence, and 1 very small puppy in a cardboard box that looked like it came from someone's recent online shopping delivery. Betty, who'd worked at the shelter for 12 years, picked up the box and looked inside. She'd seen thousands of animals come through these doors, but something about this little one made her pause. The puppy was incredibly small, but her eyes were bright and alert. She tried to climb up the sides of the box when she saw Betty's face, her tiny paws scrambling against the cardboard. "Well, hello there, little one," Betty said softly. "What's your story?" She carried the box inside where it was warmer. The shelter was already full of dogs barking, cats meowing, and the general chaos that came with housing dozens of homeless animals in a space built for half that many. Betty had seen the numbers. They were taking in more animals than they could place. And small puppies, especially ones that looked sickly or weak, were always the hardest to find homes for. The puppy was placed in a small kennel in the puppy room. The space was clean but basic. Concrete floors, chain-link walls, and a small bed that looked enormous compared to her tiny body. She spent the first day hiding in the corner, overwhelmed by all the new sounds and smells. Other potential adopters came and went throughout the week. Families looking for the perfect pet. People who wanted a dog that would grow big enough to protect their home. Kids who pointed at the larger, more playful puppies and begged their parents to take them home. The little German shepherd watched them all through the chain link of her kennel. She would come to the front and try to get their attention, tail wagging hopefully. But time after time, people would look at her, comment on how small she was, and move on to bigger puppies that looked more like what they had in mind. "She's cute, but she's so tiny," one woman said to her husband. "What if there's something wrong with her? What if she never grows?" "This one's more what we're looking for," a man told his son, pointing to a larger puppy 2 kennels down. "We need a dog that can keep up with you when you're older." Each day brought new disappointments. The little puppy tried everything she could think of. She would stand on her back legs to look bigger. She would bark her tiny bark to show she was brave. She would bring her toy to the front of the kennel to show she was friendly. But nothing worked. Betty and the other staff members began to worry. Space was tight, and animals that didn't get adopted within a few weeks faced difficult decisions. The puppy was healthy enough, just small. But in a world where people wanted guarantees and perfect pets, being different was often enough to seal an animal's fate. 3 weeks passed. The little dog learned the routines of the shelter. She knew when feeding time was, when cleaning happened, when the busy adoption hours brought hopeful families through the building. She had stopped rushing to the front of her kennel every time someone walked by. Instead, she would watch quietly from her bed, those amber eyes taking in everything around her, though she had no way of knowing that her story was about to change completely. That somewhere across town, a man who understood what it felt like to be overlooked was about to hear about her situation. That her size, the very thing that had led to her abandonment, would become the reason someone would move mountains to give her a home. Joe Crowfeather had to duck every time he walked through a doorway. At 6 feet 8 inches tall, the world wasn't built for someone his size. Chairs were too small, cars were cramped, and people always stared when he walked into a room. But Joe was used to it. He'd been the tallest person in most rooms since he was 15 years old. What people noticed first was his size. What they remembered was his gentleness. Joe worked construction, building houses and commercial buildings around Oklahoma City. His hands were massive, rough from years of handling tools and materials. But those same hands could thread a needle, or fix a bird's broken wing with incredible care. On this particular Thursday morning, Joe was sitting in his usual spot at Danny's Diner, trying to fit his long legs under the small table. A coffee cup looked like a toy in his hands. He was reading the local paper when his neighbor Frank slid into the booth across from him. Frank was a small man, probably 5'6" on a good day. Next to Joe, he looked like a child. But they'd been friends for 8 years, ever since Frank moved into the house next to Joe's property. Frank was the kind of person who knew everyone's business, but in a caring way, not a nosy one. "Joe, I need to tell you something," Frank said, his voice serious. "My sister works at the county animal shelter. She called me last night about this puppy they've got." Joe looked up from his paper. He'd always had a soft spot for animals, especially ones that needed help. Growing up on the reservation, his grandmother had taught him that all creatures deserved respect and care. She used to say that how you treated the smallest and weakest said everything about who you really were. "What about the puppy?" Joe asked. Frank shook his head. She's been there almost a month now. German Shepherd, but she's tiny. Really tiny. Everyone who comes in takes one look and walks away. They think something's wrong with her because of her size. Joe set down his coffee cup. He knew what it felt like to be judged by how you looked. People saw his size and made assumptions. Some was scared of him before he even spoke. Others thought he must be slow or simple because he was so big. He'd learned to live with it, but it never stopped hurting. "What's going to happen to her?" Joe asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. "Well," Frank said carefully, "the shelter's overcrowded. They can't keep animals forever. If nobody wants them. My sister says the puppy is perfectly healthy, just small, but that's not what people are looking for." Joe finished his coffee in one gulp and stood up. The other people in the diner turned to look like they always did. When his full height was revealed, he was used to being a spectacle. "Where's this shelter?" he asked. An hour later, Joe's pickup truck pulled into the shelter parking lot. He had to adjust the seat all the way back just to fit inside the cab. The shelter looked even more rundown than he'd expected. The building was old, and you could hear dogs barking from the parking lot. Inside, the smell hit him first. It wasn't bad, exactly, but it was the smell of too many animals in too small a space. A young woman behind the counter looked up when he walked in. Her eyes went wide for just a second, the way people's eyes always did when they first saw him. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here about a puppy," Joe said. His voice was deep but gentle. "German Shepherd, been here about a month?" The woman's face lit up. "Luna! Oh my goodness, yes." "Are you interested in meeting her?" Joe nodded. "If that's okay." "More than okay," the woman said, coming around the counter. "I'm Betty, by the way. I've been working with Luna since she got here. She's special." Betty led Joe through a series of doors into the dog area. The barking got louder as they walked. Dogs of all sizes were in kennels along both walls, most of them rushing to the front of their cages when they saw visitors. Joe stopped at several kennels, his heart breaking a little at each hopeful face. "Here she is," Betty said, stopping. At a kennel near the end of the row, Joe looked down and saw the smallest German Shepherd he'd ever laid eyes on. She was sitting in the back corner of her kennel, watching them with intelligent amber eyes. When she saw Joe looking at her, she stood up and took a few careful steps forward. The difference in their sizes was almost comical. Joe was this giant of a man, and she was this tiny puppy that couldn't have weighed more than 25 pounds. But something happened when their eyes met. Joe felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that he didn't even know had been closed. "She's beautiful," Joe said softly. Luna seemed to sense something different about this visitor. She came all the way to the front of her kennel and stood on her back legs, trying to get closer to Joe. Her tail wagged hesitantly, like she was afraid to hope too much. Joe knelt down, which took some doing given his size. Even kneeling, he was still taller than most people standing up, but it brought him closer to Luna's level. He put one massive finger through the chain link, and Luna sniffed it carefully before giving it a tiny lick. "Can I hold her?" Joe asked. Betty opened the kennel door, and Luna stepped out cautiously. She looked even smaller outside the kennel, standing next to Joe's enormous boots. Joe reached down and gently picked her up. She fit easily in his two hands, looking like a toy next to his massive frame. Something magical happened in that moment. Luna, who had been cautious and reserved with every other visitor, relaxed completely in Joe's arms. She nestled against his chest and looked up at his face with those amber eyes. It was like she knew she was safe. "She's never done that before," Betty said, amazement in her voice. "She's always been shy with strangers." Joe held Luna carefully, feeling her tiny heart beating against his palm. He thought about his grandmother, who had passed away 5 years ago. She would have loved this little dog. She would have said that sometimes the smallest packages contain the biggest spirits. "Has anyone else been interested in her?" Joe asked, though he already knew he wasn't leaving without Luna. Betty sighed. "A few people have asked about her, but when they see how small she is, they change their minds. Everyone wants a big German Shepherd. They want a dog that looks impressive, that can guard their house? They take one look at Luna and think she's defective somehow. Joe felt anger rise in his chest, not at Betty but at the whole situation. Luna wasn't defective. She was perfect exactly as she was. People just couldn't see past her size to who she really was inside. What do I need to do to take her home? Joe asked. Betty's smile could have lit up the whole building. Are you serious? You really want to adopt her? I really want to adopt her, Joe confirmed. The paperwork took an hour. Joe had to answer questions about his living situation, his experience with dogs, his plans for Luna's care. He told Betty about his 40 acres, about his grandmother who had taught him to respect all living things, about how he understood what it was like to be judged for being different when they were finished. Betty handed Joe a small bag with Luna's few belongings. A tiny collar, a small toy, and a blanket that smelled like the shelter. She's lucky to have found you, Betty said, tears in her eyes. I was starting to worry that she'd never find the right person. Joe looked down at Luna, who was still nestled comfortably in his arms. I think I'm the lucky one, he said as they walked to the parking lot. Joe felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. This little dog needed him, and he needed her. They were both different from what people expected, but maybe that was exactly why they belonged together. Luna looked up at him as he opened the truck door, her amber eyes full of trust. For the first time since she'd been abandoned, she wasn't afraid. This giant man with gentle hands felt like home. The drive home from the shelter took 30 minutes, but it felt like the most important 30 minutes of Joe's life. Luna sat in the passenger seat on a folded blanket, looking out the window at the world rushing by. Every few minutes, she would look over at Joe like she was making sure he was still there. Still real, Joe's property sat at the end of a dirt road, 40 acres of Oklahoma wilderness that his grandfather had left him. The land rolled and dipped like a green ocean, covered in native prairie grass that turned gold in the fall. Ancient oak trees dotted the landscape, some of them over 100 years old. A small creek wandered through the middle of the property, providing fresh water year-round. When Joe pulled up to his house, Luna stood up on the seat to get a better look. The house itself was modest, a single-story ranch that Joe had built himself 5 years ago. But it was the land that took your breath away. Miles of open space with no neighbors in sight. Joe carried Luna into the house and she immediately began exploring. Her tiny paws clicked on the hardwood floors as she investigated every corner, every smell, every sound. The house was clearly built for someone Joe's size. High ceilings, wide doorways, everything proportioned for a giant. Luna looked even smaller inside, like a toy dog in a regular-sized house. That first night, Joe lay awake thinking. Luna was curled up on a pillow next to his bed, snoring softly. She was safe now, warm and fed. But Joe knew that wasn't enough. This little dog deserved more than just safety. She deserved a chance to be everything she was meant to be, the next morning. Joe called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. He had planning to do. Joe walked his property with Luna at his side, seeing it through new eyes. The land was beautiful, but it was also wild. There were coyotes here, hawks overhead, and rattlesnakes in the summer. For a regular-sized dog, these would be manageable dangers. For Luna, they could be deadly, but Joe's mind was already working. His grandfather had been a master craftsman, known throughout the reservation for his woodworking. He taught Joe that every problem had a solution if you were willing to think creatively and work hard enough to find it. Joe spent the weekend sketching plans. He drew diagrams on every scrap of paper he could find. The kitchen table was covered with measurements, calculations, and rough drawings of what he had in mind. Monday morning, Joe was back at work, but his mind was on his project. During lunch breaks, he talked to his crew about materials. Some of them thought he was crazy when he explained what he was planning, but Joe had helped all of them at one time or another. When Joe Crowfeather asked for help, people said yes. The first thing Joe built was a series of platforms in the oak trees. He knew Luna loved to climb, had seen her trying to get up on furniture in the house. But regular dog houses or play equipment would be too big, too clunky for someone her size. Working by lamplight after his construction job each day, Joe carefully crafted small platforms that wrapped around the tree trunks. He used cedar wood, which would weather well and smell good. Each platform was perfectly sized for Luna, with raised edges to keep her safe but low enough that she could see everything around her. The platforms were just the beginning. Joe built narrow walkways that connected the trees, creating aerial highways 20 feet off the ground. The walkways had railings on both sides, just high enough to keep Luna secure, but not so high that they blocked her view. Luna watched these construction projects with intense interest. She would sit at the base of whatever tree Joe was working on, her head tilted up, following his every move. Sometimes Joe would talk to her while he worked, explaining what he was doing. "This one's going to be your lookout post," he'd say, securing a platform 15 feet up in the big oak by the creek. "You'll be able to see the whole property from here." The walkway system took 3 weeks to complete. When Joe finally let Luna try it out, she was hesitant at first. Joe climbed up with her, his massive frame making the whole structure creak. He showed her how to use the ramps he'd built to get from one level to another, how to navigate the gentle curves he'd designed. To make the journey interesting, once Luna got the hang of it, she was unstoppable. She would race along the walkways, stop at platforms to survey her kingdom, then continue on to the next tree. From the ground, Joe would watch this tiny dog moving through the treetops like she'd been born to it, but Joe wasn't finished. He knew Luna needed shelters throughout the property, places where she could rest or take cover from weather. Regular doghouses would have been too big, too imposing for someone her size. So Joe built something different. He created a series of miniature shelters, each one perfectly proportioned for Luna. Some were tucked into the bases of trees, camouflaged with bark and natural materials. Others were built into hillsides, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Each shelter was weatherproofed, insulated, and sized so Luna could stand up comfortably inside. Joe's favorite was the shelter he built by the creek. It was raised on stilts to keep it dry during flooding, with a small deck that overhung the water. Luna could drink from the creek without getting her feet wet, and she could watch for fish from her private viewing platform. The whole project started attracting attention from Joe's neighbors. Frank would drive over in the evenings to check on the progress. Other people Joe barely knew would stop by, curious about what the giant construction worker was building for his tiny dog. "You? No, she's just a dog, right?" one neighbor said, watching Joe install a complex pulley system that would allow Luna to operate her own food and water stations. Joe looked at the man for a long moment. "She's not just anything," he said quietly. "She's Luna." The pulley system was one of Joe's proudest innovations. He'd noticed that Luna had trouble reaching her food and water bowls when they were on the ground, but putting them up high meant she couldn't get to them when she needed to. So Joe designed a system where Luna could pull a rope with her teeth, lowering her bowls to just the right height. When she was finished eating or drinking, the bowls would automatically return to their elevated position, keeping them clean and safe. Joe also installed a network of bells and wind chimes throughout the property. Each area had its own unique sound, so Joe would always know where Luna was just by listening. The bells also served as an early warning system. If something spooked Luna and she ran, the bells would track her movement and help Joe find her quickly. As summer turned to fall, Joe's sanctuary was complete. What had started as a simple rescue had become something extraordinary. Luna now had access to every inch of the 40 acres, but she could navigate it all safely. She had shelters in every corner of the property, elevated walkways that kept her above ground predators, and systems that accommodated her size rather than forcing her to adapt to a world built for bigger dogs. The transformation in Luna was remarkable. The shy, cautious dog from the shelter had become confident and adventurous. She would spend hours exploring her aerial highways, checking each shelter, patrolling her territory from 20 feet in the air. She moved through the property like she owned it, because in every way that mattered, she did. Joe would watch her from his kitchen window while he drank his morning coffee. This tiny dog moving through an elaborate system he'd built just for her. His grandfather would have been proud, Joel thought. Not just of the craftsmanship, but of the reason behind it. Luna had taught Joe something important. Size didn't determine worth. Being different wasn't something to be ashamed of. Sometimes the smallest things required the biggest gestures of love. And sometimes when you built something with your heart instead of just your hands, you created something truly magical. Spring came early that year, and with it came Joe's most important project yet. Luna had mastered her aerial highways and claimed every shelter as her own, but Joe knew that wasn't enough. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, words she'd spoken when he was just a boy learning to hunt and fish on the reservation. "The land will teach you everything you need to know," she used to say. "But first you have to learn how to listen." Joe wanted Luna to truly understand the wilderness around her. Not just how to navigate it safely, but how to read it, respect it, and become part of it. This education would require patience, time, and knowledge that had been passed down through generations of his family. The lessons began at dawn. Joe would wake before sunrise, make his coffee, and walk out to find Luna already waiting by the back door. She seemed to sense that something important was happening, that these weren't just regular walks around the property. Their first lesson happened by the creek. Joe sat on a fallen log, his massive frame folding down until he was closer to Luna's eye level. Luna settled beside him, alert and ready. For 30 minutes they just sat in complete silence. At first, Luna was restless. She wanted to explore, to run, to investigate the interesting smells around the water. But Joe remained perfectly still, and gradually Luna began to understand. This wasn't about moving. This was about watching and listening. As the minutes passed, the world around them came alive. Birds began their morning songs, each species with its own distinct call. A family of rabbits emerged from the tall grass to drink from the creek. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, scanning the ground for movement. "You hear that?" Joe whispered, pointing toward a group of crows that had suddenly started cawing loudly in the oak trees. "Something's got them upset." Luna's ears perked up. The crows were indeed agitated, flying from branch to branch and making a terrible racket. Joe stood slowly and led Luna toward the trees. Sure enough, a raccoon was trying to raid a crow's nest, and the whole family was working together to drive it away. "Crows are nature's alarm system," Joe explained softly. "When they make noise like that, something's happening. Could be a predator, could be bad weather coming. Always pay attention to the crows." Over the following weeks, Joe taught Luna to read the signs that most people never noticed. The way grass bent when deer had passed through during the night. How the wind direction changed before a storm. The difference between the bark of a dog and the howl of a coyote. Luna proved to be an excellent student. Her small size, which had once been seen as a weakness, became an advantage in these lessons. She could move quietly through the grass without disturbing anything. She could hide in places where larger animals would never fit. She could observe without being observed. Joe's grandfather had taught him that every plant in Oklahoma had a purpose. Some were food, some were medicine, and some were dangerous. Joe began teaching Luna these same lessons. Though adapted for a dog's needs and instincts, he showed her which berries were safe to eat if she ever got lost and hungry. Wild blackberries grew along the fence line, and Joe would let Luna sample them carefully. He taught her to recognize poison ivy and sumac, plants that could make her sick if she rolled in them. "This one's your friend," Joe said, kneeling next to a patch of wild mint by the creek. "If your stomach ever hurts, you can eat a little bit of this." Luna sniffed the plant carefully, committing its scent to memory. The water lessons were crucial. Oklahoma weather could be unpredictable, and creeks that looked harmless could turn dangerous quickly. Joe taught Luna how to read water, how to tell if it was flowing too fast or too deep for someone her size. He built a small training course along the creek, with different challenges that mimicked real situations Luna might face. Fallen logs she had to navigate around. Shallow pools where she could practice crossing safely. Steep banks where she learned to find the safest way down to the water. "Never try to cross when it's muddy like this," Joe said after a spring rain had turned the usually clear creek brown with runoff. Muddy water means it's moving fast upstream. Fast water can knock you down even if you're just getting a drink. Luna listened intently to every lesson. She seemed to understand that this wasn't just playtime. This was survival training that could save her life someday. The wildlife lessons were the most complex. Joe's grandfather had taught him that every animal in the area had its own personality, its own territory, its own danger level. Joe began introducing Luna to her neighbors, teaching her which ones to avoid and which ones she could safely share space with. The rabbits were easy. They were more afraid of Luna than she was of them, and they'd run long before she could get close enough to cause problems. The squirrels were different. They were territorial and could be aggressive if they thought Luna was threatening their food stores or babies. See how that squirrel's tail is twitching? Joe pointed to a large fox squirrel in the oak tree above them. And listen to that chattering sound. He's telling you to back off. Respect that. Give him his space. The bird lessons were fascinating. Joe taught Luna to recognize the calls that meant danger was approaching. Blue jays would scream warnings. When hawks were hunting, mockingbirds would dive-bomb anything that got too close to their nests. Cardinals had different calls for different types of threats. Luna learned to look up when she heard certain bird calls, scanning the sky for hawks or eagles that might see her as prey. Joe showed her the safe spots under thick tree cover where raptors couldn't dive down to grab her. The coyote lessons were the most serious. Coyotes lived in the area, and while they usually avoided humans, a small dog alone could be seen as an easy target. Joe taught Luna their scent, their tracks, their habits. Coyotes are smart, Joe explained as they examined tracks in the mud by the creek. They hunt in packs and they're most active at dawn and dusk. If you ever smell this scent or hear howling, that sounds close. You get up in the trees immediately. Don't try to run across open ground. Joe also taught Luna about the weather patterns that were unique to Oklahoma. How the sky looked before a tornado, the feeling in the air before a severe thunderstorm, the way animals behaved when dramatic weather changes were coming. Your ears are better than mine, Joe told her during a lesson about reading atmospheric pressure. You'll feel storms coming before I do. When your ears start bothering you and you seem restless, that usually means weather's changing. As summer progressed, Luna's confidence in the wilderness grew dramatically. She began to move through the property with the ease of a wild animal, reading signs and responding to dangers before Joe even noticed them. One evening, Luna suddenly stopped during their walk and looked toward the eastern fence line. Her body went rigid, her ears forward. Joe couldn't see or hear anything unusual, but he trusted Luna's instincts. They climbed up to one of the tree platforms and waited. 10 minutes later, a family of coyotes emerged from the tree line, moving along the fence toward the creek. They passed directly below Luna's old route, exactly where she would have been walking if she hadn't sensed them coming. Good girl, Joe whispered, scratching behind Luna's ears. You're learning to listen to the land. By the end of summer, Luna had become something extraordinary. She was still the same small dog who had been abandoned for being too tiny. But now she moved through 40 acres of wilderness with the confidence and knowledge of an animal born wild. She could find water in a drought, shelter in a storm, and safety when predators were near. Joe kept a journal of Luna's progress, writing down each new skill she mastered, each lesson she learned. Reading through it, he realized that Luna had become more than just a pet who happened to live in the country. She had become a true child of the wilderness, small in size but enormous in spirit and knowledge. The shy, frightened puppy from the shelter was gone. In her place was a confident, capable dog who understood her place in the natural world and knew how to thrive in it. 3 years had passed since that cold February morning when Luna first arrived at Joe's property. The tiny, frightened puppy who once hid in shelter corners had become something remarkable. She now weighed 32 pounds, still small for a German shepherd, but every ounce was pure confidence and intelligence. On this particular autumn morning, Luna was perched on her favorite platform in the big oak tree, surveying her domain like a queen watching over her kingdom. The morning Mist was lifting from the creek, and the first golden leaves of fall were beginning to drop. Luna's amber eyes tracked every movement below, from the family of rabbits near the water to the red squirrel gathering acorns for winter. Joe was in his workshop, putting finishing touches on a new project. Word about Luna and her incredible sanctuary had spread throughout Oklahoma County. What started as whispered conversations between neighbors had grown into something much bigger. It began with Dr. Rodriguez, the veterinarian who had examined Luna during her first week with Joe. She had been amazed by Luna's health and confidence, especially considering her rough start in life. When Dr. Rodriguez mentioned Luna's story to other clients, they wanted to see this miraculous transformation. For themselves, the first visitors were Frank's family. His grandchildren had begged to meet the famous tiny dog who lived in the trees. Joe was hesitant at first. Luna's sanctuary was her safe space, and he didn't want to turn it into a tourist attraction. But when he saw how gently the children approached Luna, how respectfully they listened to her story, Joe realized something important was happening. Luna seemed to enjoy the visitors. She would perform for them, racing along her aerial highways, demonstrating how she used her pulley system for food and water, showing off her various shelters. But more than that, she seemed to understand that she was teaching them something valuable. She's so small, but she's not scared of anything, 8-year-old Tommy said, watching Luna navigate a particularly challenging section of walkway 30 feet off the ground. That's because she learned that being small doesn't mean being weak, Joe explained. It just means you have to be smarter about how you handle problems. Word continued to spread. A reporter from the local newspaper came out to do a story about Joe and Luna. The article, titled "Giant Heart, Tiny Dog," ran on the front page and included photos of Luna in her treetop kingdom. That's when everything changed. Joe's phone started ringing constantly. People from 3 counties away wanted to bring their children to see Luna, but more importantly, other animal lovers started calling with a different kind of request. "I have this dog," a woman named Carol said during one phone call. "He's a Chihuahua mix, maybe 6 pounds. I found him abandoned on the roadside. He's healthy, but nobody wants him because he's so small. I heard about what you did for Luna. Joe looked out his kitchen window at Luna, who was teaching a small group of visiting children about reading bird calls. She had positioned herself on a low platform so they could see her better, and she was demonstrating how she tilted her head to catch different sounds. "Bring him out this weekend," Joe said. "Let's see if Luna has room for a friend." That's how Pablo joined the family. The tiny Chihuahua was even smaller than Luna had been as a puppy, with enormous ears and eyes that took up half his face. He was terrified of everything, shaking constantly and refusing to eat. Luna took charge immediately. She showed Pablo the safest routes around the property, starting with ground-level paths before gradually introducing him to the elevated walkways. She demonstrated how to use the shelter system, how to read weather signs, how to communicate with the local wildlife. Within 2 weeks, Pablo was racing through the trees alongside Luna, his confidence growing daily. Joe had to build smaller platforms and narrower walkways to accommodate Pablo's size, but watching the two of them work together made every hour of construction worthwhile. Then came Rosie, a miniature dachshund with a crooked spine that made her walk funny. Then Chester, a 3-legged terrier mix who had lost his leg in an accident. Then Penny, a senior Pomeranian whose family couldn't care for her anymore. Each new arrival brought its own challenges. Joe found himself designing different solutions for different needs. Chester needed ramps instead of stairs. Rosie needed extra cushioning in her shelters. Penny needed warming stations for her arthritis, but Luna remained the alpha. The teacher, the one who showed each newcomer how to thrive despite their differences. She had developed her own system for introducing new dogs to the sanctuary. First, she would assess their abilities and fears. Then she would create a custom training program, starting with small, achievable goals and building up to more complex challenges. Joe watched this process with amazement. Luna had become a natural teacher, patient but firm, encouraging but realistic. She seemed to understand that every dog was different and needed a different approach. The sanctuary was growing, but so was its impact on the community. Joe started getting calls from parents whose children had visited Luna and gone home asking questions about kindness, about differences, about giving chances to those who needed them. "My daughter hasn't stopped talking about Luna since we visited. Last month," one mother told Joe. "She's been volunteering at the local animal shelter, helping with the small dogs that nobody wants. She says Luna taught her that size doesn't matter, heart does." Schools began requesting field trips. Joe was reluctant at first, but Luna seemed to love the attention. She would position herself where the children could see her best and perform her most impressive feats. More importantly, she would sit still while Joe told her story. As if she understood the importance of what the children were learning, Joe began incorporating his grandfather's teachings into these presentations. He talked about respect for all living things, about the Comanche belief that every creature has a purpose and a place in the world. He explained how traditional indigenous knowledge about reading nature had helped Luna become confident in the wilderness. Local teenagers started volunteering at the sanctuary, learning construction skills while helping Joe build new sections for the growing population of rescued animals. Many of these kids were from the reservation, and Joe found himself passing on not just building techniques, but cultural wisdom about living in harmony with the land. "My grandfather always said that how we treat the smallest and most vulnerable says everything about who we are," Joe would tell the young volunteers as they worked on a new shelter or walkway. "Luna and her friends aren't just animals we're helping. They're teachers showing us how to be better humans." The sanctuary had become a place of healing for more than just abandoned animals. Families dealing with children who felt different or left out would come to see Luna. Veterans struggling with PTSD found peace walking the quiet trails with the dogs. Elderly people who had lost their own pets discovered joy again watching Luna's pack play in the trees. Joe kept detailed records of every animal that came through the sanctuary. Some stayed permanently, becoming part of Luna's extended family. Others were eventually adopted by families who understood that different didn't mean defective. But all of them left changed, confident in ways they never could have been without Luna's guidance. 5 years after that cold morning when Joe first saw Luna in the shelter, the sanctuary housed 12 permanent residents and had helped over 40 animals find homes. But the real measure of success wasn't in numbers. It was in the 8-year-old girl who started a kindness club at her school after meeting Luna. It was in the teenager who decided to become a veterinarian specializing in special needs animals. It was in the elderly man who adopted a 3-legged cat because Luna taught me that perfect doesn't exist, but wonderful comes in all shapes and sizes. Every evening, Joe would sit on his porch and watch Luna lead her pack through their final patrol of the day. 12 dogs of various sizes and abilities, all moving with confidence through a world designed specifically for their needs. Luna would always finish by visiting Joe on the porch, settling beside his chair with the satisfaction of a job well done. "You did good today, girl," Joe would tell her, scratching behind her ears. "Grandma would be proud of both of us." Luna had proven that being abandoned for being too small was just the beginning of her story, not the end. She had shown the world that with enough love, creativity, and respect, any creature could not only survive but thrive. Most importantly, she had taught everyone who met her that sometimes the smallest packages contain the biggest hearts, and the greatest teachers come in the most unexpected forms.